Welcome to another deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure to be here.
You've brought us a fascinating topic today.
Yeah.
The Tet Offensive.
A Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War.
And to unpack it all, we've got excerpts from a podcast
Yeah.
featuring a real Vietnam War historian.
A historian who's spent a lot of time really digging into this.
You probably already know.
Mm.
The Tet Offensive was this series of surprise attacks in 1968.
Exactly.
But the thing is,
Yeah.
they happened during Tet,
Right.
the Vietnamese Lunar New Year,
The Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a time when...
a time when there was supposed to be a truce.
Right.
So you can imagine the shockwaves this sent through everyone.
Yeah, that surprise element was key, I think.
Yeah.
It really threw a wrench
Yeah,
in the plans
absolutely.
of both the American and South Vietnamese forces.
Yeah.
It's almost like the North Vietnamese were playing 4D chess
Yeah,
while everyone else was stuck with checkers.
that's a great analogy.
It is.
So to really get the impact of the Tet Offensive,
Yeah.
we need to rewind a bit
Right.
and look at Vietnam
Yes.
before all this went down.
Absolutely. Our historian does a good job setting the stage.
Okay.
Remember, Vietnam was divided into North and South.
Right.
After the First Indochina War ended in 1954.
Gotcha.
The U.S. was heavily involved
Yeah.
in propping up South Vietnam.
Right.
And by late 1967,
Okay.
there was a massive American military presence there.
And what was their strategy at that point?
Well,
I know they were sending troops out
mhm.
on these search and destroy missions,
Right.
but were they actually effective?
Well, that's a complex question.
Yeah.
On the surface, they seem like a straightforward way
Yeah.
to find and eliminate enemy forces.
Yeah.
But what often gets overlooked
Okay.
is the context.
Right.
The North Vietnamese had been incredibly savvy.
Okay.
They'd spent years infiltrating villages
Right.
in South Vietnam,
Yeah.
building networks and gaining the trust
Mm-hmm.
of the local population.
Interesting.
It wasn't just about military tactics.
Right.
It was about winning hearts and minds.
Okay.
And that played a huge role
Yeah.
in the Tet Offensive's success.
So, in a way,
Hmm?
the U.S. was fighting a conventional war,
Yeah.
while the North Vietnamese were waging a guerrilla war that blended right into the fabric of
Easy.
Vietnamese society.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that made it incredibly difficult
Yeah.
for the U.S.
Yeah.
to distinguish friend from foe.
Wow.
It also created a real dilemma.
Okay.
How do you fight an enemy that's embedded within the civilian population?
Okay, so let's fast forward to January 1968.
Okay.
It's Tet,
Mhm.
a time for celebration
Right.
and family.
Yeah.
Then boom,
Boom.
the North Vietnamese launched these coordinated attacks
Mhm.
on something like 100 towns and cities across South Vietnam.
Yes. Talk about a rude awakening. The sheer scale and audacity of the offensive
Yeah,
caught everyone off guard.
absolutely.
And the North Vietnamese weren't just hitting random targets.
Right.
They focused on urban areas,
Yeah,
which were considered government strongholds.
right.
Places like Saigon,
Yeah,
the capital,
right.
and Hue.
Hugh.
Yeah.
Now, that was a particularly brutal battle,
It was.
wasn't it?
Yes.
I know it was the old imperial capital,
Mm-hmm.
so it had a lot of symbolic significance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The fighting in Hue was incredibly fierce.
Wow.
The city was practically leveled,
Oh, wow.
and the casualties on both sides were staggering.
Yeah.
Our historian recommends a book
Okay.
called Hue 1968
Right.
by Mark Bowden,
Mm-hmm.
if you want a really deep dive
Yeah.
into that specific battle.
Okay.
It really captures
Mm-hmm.
the chaos and brutality of the fighting.
Definitely adding that to my reading list.
It's a good one.
But amidst all the chaos, there was one attack that really shook America to its core. The assault on the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon.
Right. And while the attack was eventually repelled,
Yeah.
the symbolic damage was immense.
Yeah.
Imagine watching the news and seeing
Yeah.
your seemingly invincible embassy under siege.
Right.
It'd be like realizing that Superman could bleed.
It must have shattered this
Yeah.
sense of American invulnerability, especially after years
Right.
of being told that victory was just around the corner.
Exactly. It was a major psychological blow.
Yeah.
In a way,
Yeah.
it was similar
Yeah.
to the Iran hostage crisis in 1979.
Right.
Both events exposed the limits
Yeah.
of American power
Yeah.
and the vulnerability
Right.
of seemingly untouchable symbols of American might.
So what exactly were the North Vietnamese hoping to achieve with the Tet Offensive?
That's a good question.
Was it purely about symbolism and shock value, or did they have more concrete military goals?
Well, according to our historian,
Okay.
their goals were multifaceted.
Okay.
They wanted to spark a popular uprising in South Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
discredit the South Vietnamese government,
Yeah.
and turn global public opinion against the war.
Right.
It was a bold gamble,
Yeah.
a high-stakes poker game where they were all in.
And while they may not have achieved a decisive military victory,
Right.
they certainly accomplished some of those goals.
We did.
Didn't they?
Yeah.
The images of the fighting,
Hmm?
the casualties,
Right.
the sheer ferocity of the attacks,
Yeah.
it all had a profound impact on American public opinion.
It did. Absolutely. You see, the North Vietnamese understood something crucial.
Yeah.
War isn't just fought on battlefields.
Right.
It's fought in the minds of people,
Okay.
both home and abroad.
So they were playing the long game, weren't they?
They were.
Realizing they couldn't win through sheer military force.
Right.
They went for a psychological victory.
Precisely. They knew that if they could erode American support for the war,
Mm-hmm.
they could ultimately force a withdrawal.
Right.
And the Tet Offensive, with its shocking images
Yeah.
of urban warfare and heavy casualties,
Right.
played right into that strategy.
It's fascinating how those images
Yeah.
broadcast into American living rooms night after night
Right.
really shifted the narrative of the war.
Mhm.
Suddenly, it wasn't about containing communism or,
Right.
or fighting for democracy.
Yeah.
It was about the human cost,
Mm-hmm.
the futility of it all.
Yeah. It's almost as if the Tet Offensive ripped the curtain back
Yeah.
and exposed the messy, brutal reality of the war.
Right. And remember, this was happening against a backdrop
Exactly.
of intense social and political upheaval
Right.
in the United States.
Yeah.
The civil rights movement, the anti-war protests,
Uh-huh.
a nation deeply divided.
Right.
It was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire.
Absolutely.
How did President Johnson even navigate that political landscape? With the military pushing for escalation and a growing segment of the population demanding de-escalation.
It was a tightrope walk, to say the least.
Yeah.
The military was requesting a massive troop surge,
Okay.
over 200,000 additional soldiers,
Wow.
and there was talk of calling up the reserves.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine
Yeah.
the political fallout from that?
It seems like a recipe for disaster.
It would been.
But on the other hand,
Yeah.
if Johnson didn't escalate,
Right.
wouldn't that be seen as a sign of weakness?
Right.
Emboldening the North Vietnamese even further?
That was the dilemma. He was
Mhm.
damned if he did, damned if he didn't.
Right.
But the Tet Offensive had revealed something crucial:
Okay.
the limits of American military power.
Mm-hmm.
It showed that even with superior firepower,
Right.
the U.S. couldn't easily subdue a determined enemy,
Yeah.
fighting on their own terrain,
Right.
fueled by ideology and a deep-seated will to resist.
So in a sense, the Tet Offensive forced a reckoning. It forced America to confront the reality that victory, at least as it had been envisioned,
Right.
might be unattainable.
Exactly. And that realization had a profound impact
Yeah.
on Johnson's decision-making.
Okay.
He started to shift away from escalation
Right.
and towards de-escalation,
Okay.
eventually choosing not to seek re-election
Wow.
and pursuing peace negotiations.
It's incredible how this one event,
I know.
the Tet Offensive, rippled outwards, impacting not just the battlefield,
Yeah.
but the highest levels of American politics.
It really highlights how intertwined war and politics are,
Yeah.
how military decisions can have profound political consequences, and vice versa.
You know, we've talked a lot about the images of the Tet Offensive
Mhm.
and its impact on public opinion,
Right.
but I'm curious about the role of journalists in all this.
Okay.
The Vietnam War is often called the first television war,
Right.
and some argue that the media's coverage was biased or overly negative, even undermining the war effort.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on that?
Well, our historian actually defends the journalists
Okay.
who covered the Vietnam War.
Mhm.
He argues that for the most part, their reporting was accurate
Okay.
and played a vital role in informing the public.
Right.
Remember, this was a time before the 10-4/7 news cycle,
Right.
social media,
Yeah.
and the constant bombardment of information we experience today.
Yeah.
People relied on a handful of trusted news sources
Right.
for their understanding of the war.
So in a sense, those journalists were the eyes and ears
Exactly.
of the American public, bringing the realities of the war into their homes
Right.
in a way that hadn't been possible before.
Exactly. And while some of the images were undoubtedly graphic and disturbing,
Mm-hmm.
they reflected the harsh realities of the conflict.
Right.
One particularly striking example our historian brings up
Okay.
is the iconic photograph
Mm.
of the execution of a Viet Cong prisoner by a South Vietnamese officer
Yeah.
during the Tet Offensive.
That image is seared into my memory.
Yeah,
It's brutal,
it is.
but it also captures something essential
Right.
about the nature of war,
Mm-hmm.
the raw violence, the
Yeah.
disregard for human life.
That's the power of photojournalism.
Yeah.
It can convey in a single frame
Right.
the emotional weight of an event
Mm-hmm.
in a way that words sometimes can't.
Right.
And in the case of the Tet Offensive,
Yeah.
those images played a crucial role
Right.
in shaping public perception.
Yeah.
They forced people to confront the human cost of the war,
Mm-hmm.
to question the narrative they were being fed by the government,
Right.
and to demand accountability.
It seems like the Tet Offensive,
Yeah.
with its combination of military action,
Right.
political maneuvering, and media coverage, created a perfect storm
It did.
that fundamentally shifted the American public's understanding of the war.
Yes. And that shift had lasting consequences. Not just for Vietnam,
Yeah.
but for how America viewed its role in the world.
Right.
But before we dive into that,
Okay.
let's shift gears a bit
Yeah.
and explore the long-term consequences of the Tet Offensive
Okay.
for both Vietnam and the United States.
Okay, so we've covered the immediate impact of the Tet Offensive.
Right.
But what about the long-term consequences?
Right.
How did it shape the trajectory of the war?
Yeah.
And what lasting effects did it have
Yeah.
on both Vietnam and the U.S.?
Well, for Vietnam, the Tet Offensive was a pivotal moment.
Okay.
Even though it was a tactical defeat
Right.
for the North Vietnamese,
Yeah.
it demonstrated their resilience and determination,
Oh, okay.
proving they could strike at the heart of South Vietnam. Despite American military might,
Yeah.
it also exposed the vulnerabilities
Yeah.
of the South Vietnamese government,
Okay.
shaking public confidence
Mhm.
and fueling doubts about their ability to win the war.
It's like the Tet Offensive shattered this illusion of American invincibility,
Oh, yeah.
both for the Vietnamese
Mhm.
and for the American public back home.
Exactly. And it emboldened the North Vietnamese,
Okay.
reinforcing their commitment
Yeah.
to a protracted war of attrition.
Right.
They knew they couldn't win a decisive military victory
Okay.
in a conventional sense.
Right.
But they also knew that time was on their side.
Yeah.
They were willing to endure heavy losses,
Mm-hmm.
to fight for years, even decades, if necessary.
Wow.
The Tet Offensive showed them that the American public,
Right.
facing mounting casualties,
Yeah.
a seemingly endless conflict,
Right.
might not have the same stomach for a long war.
And that brings us to the U.S. side of the equation. We've talked about the psychological impact of the Tet Offensive, the erosion of public trust, the fueling of the anti-war movement. But how did it affect American foreign policy
Yeah,
in the long run?
the Vietnam War. Okay, and the Tet Offensive in particular became a cautionary tale
Right.
in American foreign policy circles.
Interesting.
It instilled a deep skepticism
Yeah.
about military interventions,
Okay.
especially in complex, far-off conflicts,
Right.
where clear objectives
Mm-hmm.
and achievable victory seemed elusive.
Right.
It also highlighted the importance of public support
Okay.
for any successful military endeavor.
Yeah.
The Tet Offensive showed how quickly public opinion could sour
Right.
when confronted with the realities of war,
Mm-hmm.
the casualties,
Yeah.
the moral ambiguities.
So it's almost like the ghost of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
The shadow of the Tet Offensive
Right.
has loomed over
Right.
every subsequent American military intervention.
Yes, there's a term often used
Okay.
to describe this phenomenon,
Right.
Vietnam Syndrome.
Vietnam syndrome.
It refers to this reluctance
Okay.
to commit American ground troops
Right.
to prolonged conflicts,
Yeah.
this fear of getting bogged down
Right.
in another quagmire like Vietnam.
But the world has changed a lot since the 1960s.
It has.
We have new technologies, new threats, new
Yeah.
geopolitical realities.
Okay.
Is Vietnam syndrome
Mhm.
still a relevant concept today?
It's a valid question.
Yeah.
And while direct comparisons can be tricky,
Right.
I think the lessons of Vietnam,
Yeah.
the awareness of the limits of military power,
Mm-hmm.
and the importance of public support
Yeah.
remain highly relevant.
Okay.
Take, for instance,
Yeah.
the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right.
While the contexts were different,
Right.
there are clear parallels
Yeah.
in terms of the challenges of nation building,
Mm-hmm.
the complexities of fighting insurgencies,
Okay.
and the need to manage public perception.
It seems like the legacy of the Tet Offensive is multifaceted.
It is.
It's a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit
Right.
in the face of overwhelming odds.
Yeah.
A testament to the power of strategic thinking.
Right.
And psychological warfare.
Absolutely.
But it's also a cautionary tale.
It is.
About the hubris of power, the limits of military force,
Right.
and the importance of understanding
Yeah.
the human cost of war.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
The Tet Offensive was a turning point in the Vietnam War,
Right.
a pivotal event that shaped the destinies of nations and left an enduring mark on history.
Right.
It continues to spark debate,
Yeah.
inspire reflection, and offer valuable lessons for anyone grappling with the complexities of war and peace.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this deep dive
My pleasure.
into the Tet Offensive.
Happy to do it.
It's been an illuminating journey,
It has been.
exploring not just the historical events,
Right.
but the broader themes of war, politics, media,
Yeah.
and the enduring human spirit.
The pleasure was all mine.
Yeah.
And hopefully our listeners now have a deeper understanding of this pivotal event and its enduring legacy.